Hello, my name's Liz and I work for Somerset Libraries, and this Chatterbooks book club this month, March, is all about The Secret Garden. You might have heard of it because it's not long been made into a film, but before it was a film, it's been made into film lots of times and TV series, it was a book, and it was written by Frances Hodgson Burnett, and it was published in 1911. That's over 100 years old, even older than me. Well, just. And the book is about all sorts of things. It's about loss and illness and sadness, and it's got a bit of magic, sort of everyday magic, really. And it's about nature and how nature and being outside and animals and plants can help us feel better, and how we are part of the natural world. But I think the main thing that the book's about is friendship, and how friends can change your life, really. And this year's been very difficult for all of us, hasn't it? And last year, because we haven't been able to spend as much time with our family and friends, and there's been lots of things we haven't been able to do. And I think one of the things about books and about The Secret Garden is that it shows you that things can change, so things can look quite bleak. So at the beginning of the book, Mary's living in India with her parents, and both her parents die, and everything she knows is taken away from her, and she's sent away back to England, where she's never been, to live with people who she's never met. But actually that move and being sent to England changes her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. But let's start with the beginning, the opening of the book. Now, usually in books, the central characters generally are people that you like. So they're people that you'd like to have as your friends, or you feel are a bit like you, and you get interested in them and their stories. But, well, I'll read it you. You'll see The Secret Garden and the description of Mary isn't really quite like that. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. It was true, too. She had a little, thin face, and a little, thin body, thin light hair, and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow, and her face was yellow because she'd been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. Her father had held a position under the English government and had always been busy and ill himself. And her mother had been a great beauty who cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with fun people. She had not wanted a little girl at all. And when Mary was born, she handed her over to the care of an ayah, who was made to understand that if she wished to please the Mem Sahib, she must keep the child out of sight as much as possible. So when she was a sickly, fretful, ugly little baby, she was kept out of the way. And when she became a sickly, fretful, toddling thing, she was kept out of the way also. She never remembered seeing, familiarly, anything but the dark faces of her ayah and the other native servants. And as they always obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything, because the Mem Sahib would be angry if she was disturbed by her crying, by the time she was 6 years old, she was as tyrannical and selfish a little pig as ever lived. The young English governess, who came to teach her to read and write, disliked her so much that she gave up her place in 3 months. And when other governesses came to try to fill it, they always went away in a shorter time than the first. So if Mary had not chosen really to want to know how to read books, she would never have learned her letters at all. So she doesn't sound like someone, really, that you'd want to know, does she? She doesn't sound like someone who would be nice to hang out with or play with. She sounds selfish. But then what you also learn is that her parents had no time for her. Her mother really didn't want her, and she spent all her time with servants who spent all of their time trying to keep her quiet and happy. And so by the time the book starts and she's 10 years old, she's a very lonely, selfish little girl. And her parents die, and she gets sent all the way to England. And in those days, there wasn't air travel, so the book was written in 1911, which is over 100 years ago. So you went by boat, and it was a very long journey. And then when she landed in England, She was met by a stranger, and she was taken on a train, and then she was taken on a carriage, all the way to the wild Yorkshire moors. And she finds herself in a new house. But she's still surrounded by adults. There's no other children for her to play with. But the adults are kind, and they take an interest in her, particularly Martha, who works in the house, and Ben, who works in the garden. And Mary learns that 10 years ago, her Uncle Colin's wife died. And she had a beautiful rose garden hidden behind walls, a walled garden. And when she died, her uncle locked the garden and threw away the key. And Mary's really interested in this garden. She walked away, slowly thinking. She had begun to like the garden, just as she'd begun to like the robin and Dickon. Dickon is Martha's brother, and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha too. That seemed a good many people to like, when you were not used to liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She made friends with the robin as well. She went to her walk outside the long ivy-covered wall over which she could see the treetops, and the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting and exciting thing happened to her. And it was all through Ben Weatherstaff's robin. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the flower bed on her left side, there he was, hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth to persuade her that he had not followed her. But she knew he had followed her, and the surprise so filled her with delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me," she cried. "You do. You are prettier than anything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed, and he hopped and flirted his tail and twittered. It was as if he were talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny breast out and was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was really as if he were showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Mistress Mary forgot that she had ever been contrary in her life when he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him and bend down and talk and try to make something like robin sounds. And so the robin becomes her first friend, and she gets so excited that he will let her get close because he's a wild animal. And on this particular walk, the robin, well, you'll see. The flower bed was not quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter rest, but there were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed, and as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because a dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he had scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not really knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass, and when the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the ring up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key, which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her finger. "Perhaps it's been buried for 10 years, she said in a whisper. "Perhaps it's the key to the garden." So now, through her friend Ben, who introduced her to the robin, who's also her friend, she's found the key to the secret garden. But she still doesn't know where the door is. So the next morning, she goes out to look, and once again, the robin is in the garden. "You showed me where the key was yesterday," she said. "You ought to show me the door today, but I don't believe you know." The robin flew from his swinging spray of ivy on the top of the wall, and he opened his beak, and he sang a loud, lovely trill, merely to show off. Nothing in the world is quite as adorably lovely as a robin when he shows off, and they're nearly always doing it. Mary Lennox had heard a great deal about magic in her Ayah's stories, and she always said what happened almost at that moment was magic. One of the nice little gusts of wind rushed down the walk, and it was a stronger one than the rest. It was strong enough to wave the branches of the trees, and it was more than strong enough to sway the trailing sprays of untrimmed ivy hanging from the wall. Mary had stepped close to the robin, and suddenly the gust of wind swung aside some loose ivy trails, and more suddenly still, she jumped towards it and caught it in her hand. She did this because she'd seen something under it, a round knob which had been covered by the leaves hanging over it. It was the knob of the door. She put her hands under the leaves and began to pull and push them aside. Thick as the ivy hung, it nearly all was loose and swinging curtain, though some had crept over wood and iron. Mary's heart began to thump and her hands to shake a little in her delight and excitement. The robin kept singing and twittering away and tilting his head to one side as if he was excited as she was. What was this under her hands, which was square and made of iron, and which her fingers found a hole in it? It was the lock of the door, which had been closed 10 years, and she put her hand in her pocket, drew out the key, and found that it fitted the keyhole. She put the key in it and turned it. It took 2 hands to do it, but it did turn. And then she took a long breath and looked behind her up the long walk to see if anyone was coming. No one was coming. No one ever did come, it seemed, and she took another long breath because she could not help it, and she held back the swinging curtain of ivy and pushed back the door, which opened slowly, slowly. Then she slipped through it, and it shut behind her, and stood with her back against it, looking about her and breathing quite fast with excitement and wonder and delight. She was standing inside the secret garden. And the secret garden is a place where friendships are made, and she becomes friends with Dickon, who is friends with all the birds and animals. He has pet squirrels and a pet crow. And then she discovers Colin, and Colin's her cousin, and he lives in the manor, but he too is kept shut away because everybody thinks he's ill. They think he's got a problem with his back. And Mary starts to visit him and tells him stories of the garden and of Dickon and of Dickon's animals, and they become friends. And Colin's disagreeable and he shouts at the servants. He's very like Mary. But you also learn that he is the way he is, partly because he too is lonely, but also because he's frightened about dying. He thinks he's going to die, and he's thought that his whole life. And that must be terrifying. But he gets so interested in the stories that Mary tells that he decides that he wants to go outside, and he really wants to visit the secret garden. The nurse made Colin ready. She noticed that instead of lying like a log while his clothes were put on, he sat up and made some efforts to help himself, and he talked and laughed with Mary all the time. The strongest footman in the house carried Colin downstairs and put him in his wheelchair, near which Dickon waited outside. After the manservant had arranged his rugs and cushions, the Rajah, because that's what they call Colin, waved his hand to him and to the nurse. "You have my permission to go," he said, and they both disappeared quickly, and, it must be confessed, giggled once they were safely inside the house. Dickon began to push the wheelchair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back and lifted his face to the sky. The arch of it looked very high, and the small snowy clouds seemed like white birds floating on an outspread wings below its crystal blueness. The wind swept in soft, big breaths down from the moor, and was strange with a wild, clear-scented sweetness. Colin kept lifting his thin chest to draw it in, and his big eyes looked as if they were listening instead of his ears. "There are so many sounds of singing and humming and calling out," he said. "What is that scent the puffs of wind bring?" It's gorse on the moor that's up opening out, answered Dickon. The bees are at it wonderful today. Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the path they took. But when at last they turned into the long walk by the ivied walls, the excited sense of an approaching thrill made them, for some curious reason they could not have explained, begin to speak in whispers. "This is it," breathed Mary. "This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder." "Is it?" cried Colin, and his eyes began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. "But I can see nothing," he whispered. "There is no door." "That's what I thought," said Mary. Then there was a lovely, breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. "This is the garden where Ben Weatherstaff works," said Mary. "Is it?" said Colin. A few yards more, and Mary whispered again. "This is where the robin flew over the wall," she said. "Is it?" cried Colin. "I wish he'd come again." "And that," said Mary, with solemn delight, pointing under a big lilac bush, "is where he perched on the little heap of earth and showed me the key." Then Colin sat up. Where? There!" he cried, and his eyes were as big as the wolf's in Red Riding Hood, when Riding Hood felt called upon to remark on them. Dickon stood still, and the wheelchair stopped. "And this," said Mary, stepping on to the bed close to the ivy, "is where I went to talk to him when he chirped at me from the top of the wall, and this is the ivy that the wind blew back." And she took hold of the hanging green curtain. "Is it?" gasped Colin. "And here is the handle, and here is the door. Dickon, push him in quickly." And Dickon did it with one strong, steady, splendid push. And so the children start to look after the secret garden, and they start to tend it and look after all the rose bushes that Colin's mother had planted and cared for. And their friendships grow, and they learn to look after each other and to be less grumpy and sad and lonely. And Colin learns to walk. So it is a story about friendship and nature, and it's a story about how things can change and change for the better. So although the film is great, it's a really good film, I'd also say it's well worth reading the book. Some of it's a bit tricky because it talks about a time that was long ago and it's written in a slightly old-fashioned way, but actually it reads really easily, and it's a great story to get a grown-up to read aloud, or to read aloud to yourself. So I hope you've enjoyed today. I hope you've enjoyed learning a bit more about the secret garden, and enjoy being back at school and seeing your friends. Bye bye.